Miami didn't just change in the late 20th century, it mutated. Sunlight still hit the ocean the same way. Neon still flickered across glass towers, but beneath the palm trees and pastel hotels, a different system was taking root. One fueled not by ambition alone, but by fear, cash, and silence. A system where power didn't announce itself. It moved quietly, efficiently, and without mercy. This was an era when money traveled faster than the law, when entire neighborhoods learned to mind their business, when luxury became camouflage and violence became a form of communication. The city didn't fall into crime, it was rewired by it. Out of that transformation emerged a man who didn't look like a warlord, didn't sound like a gangster, and didn't rule through chaos. He ruled through structure, through discipline, through a machine that treated crime like commerce and people like expendable assets. He didn't shout his power, he managed it. While others chased notoriety, he built systems. While rivals fought in the open, he controlled ports, paperwork, and pipelines. His empire didn't depend on noise. It depended on precision. And for years it worked. But power that grows too quietly often grows too large. And when an empire stretches across borders, currencies, and institutions, it leaves traces, patterns that eventually attract the one force every criminal enterprise fears: time. Because time watches, time records, and time always collects its debt. This is not a story about glamour. It's not a story about excess. It's a story about how control is built, how violence is rationalized, and how the line between legitimacy and criminality can disappear so completely that even the people inside the system forget where it was drawn. This is the story of how Miami became a marketplace for power, and how one man learned to own it until the moment it turned on him. Miami before Scarface, birth of a cocaine kingdom. There is a cruelty to boom towns. They make saints of risk and martyrs of anyone who hesitates. Miami in those years was a fever with no cure. Ships pushed up through the Caribbean, anonymous dollars bled into the local economy, and what began as desperation turned into taste. When money rushes in faster than integrity can catch up, the city rearranges itself. Lawyers become facilitators, docks become storefronts, and police reports read like price lists. The world's appetite for cocaine turned streets into supply lines. A product that had once been hidden in whispers moved into open business models. Cabals blossomed with the speed of a tropical weed. Where legitimate capital faltered, illicit cash became solvent. Developers who could not get bank loans found partners who did not ask questions. Nightclubs that once survived on tips now floated on pallets of euro bundles. The city's center of gravity shifted, from tourism and trade to secrecy and transshipment. And into that gap stepped men who understood markets and men who understood violence. The two skills, when combined, created an almost scientific efficiency. You could engineer shipment routes like a corporation. You could run cash flows like a bank. And if a competitor attempted to disrupt the model, you could apply discipline in the form others would call terror. Here, the streets were not merely a venue for crime. They became a logistics problem solved by men who wore suits under leather jackets. The culture changed visibly. Luxury cars were no longer just status symbols. They were currency and camouflage. Beaches became meeting places for introductions. Marina slips were back doors to international banking. Restaurants sterilized deals behind menus and applause. In a single late night, you could witness a small-time hustler leave as a minor dealer and return with the means to buy legitimacy. That threshold, from street corner to offshore account, collapsed. Once crossed, the routes were hard to trace and harder to unwind. In that era, institutions that should have resisted complicitly learned to tolerate, then profit. Corruption is rarely dramatic. It is incremental. A favor here, an oversight there, a blind eye when a name mattered more than a law. Banking rules loosened where money was abundant, and officials who once demanded receipts began to accept narratives. Investment, philanthropy, community development. The money had a way of polishing guilt until it glinted like a trophy. Underneath that sheen, new corporate models of criminality took shape. This was not the era of lone wolves. It was the age of networks. Packs of operators carved routes through airports, ports, and highways. They did not rely solely on muscle. They depended on systems, lawyers, accountants, shipping agents, and front companies. Their tradecraft was methodical: channel shipments through legitimate commerce, hide profits through playback companies, and present the world with the illusion of normalcy. So when an operator with the right mix of charisma and cold planning emerged, Miami did not fight him, it absorbed him. The city's appetite meant there was room for a man who could coordinate networks across hemispheres, a man who could pair bank accounts with brutality, a man who could move product with the elegance of an importer and the ruthlessness of a warlord. He did not invent demand, but he monetized it with industrial rigor. And yet there was an almost poetic irony in the ecosystem he exploited. Miami's sunstruck nights, the palm trees, the white noise of ocean surf, they hid the mechanized heartbeat of the underworld. Brokers negotiated by the light of tiki torches, deals were signed as champagne cooled, reefer ships were re-registered as freighters hauling skincare products. The city's facade of glamour was not destroyed so much as repurposed, turned into a cover for someone who could read a ledger as easily as a threat. From this environment, a new kind of leader rose, not a sensationalist, but a strategist. He understood the math of supply and distribution. He had the patience to build hierarchies and the temperament to remove liabilities quietly. His early moves were typical of the era: small seizures, violent skirmishes, local bargains. But he had an instinct for scaling, for taking a crime scene and making it a business case. He treated people like nodes, money like oxygen, and reputation as the single most transferable asset. To his enemies, he was a phantom. To his associates, a general. His operations moved like clockwork. Shipping manifests adjusted, payments rerouted, safe houses opened and closed with bureaucratic precision. The street-level violence was the public face. The real work occurred in offices where spreadsheets and hit lists shared the same paper. He did not merely survive the city's lawlessness, he refined it. The greater the disorder, the more useful his order became. And yet order comes at a price. With every successful shipment, with every layer of legitimacy built on the bones of fear, the number of witnesses, allies, and debts grew. Systems need maintenance. People need direction. Loyalties that are transactional are as brittle as glass. The very same structures that elevated him would later provide the rails for his undoing, because the higher you build, the longer the fall. But that fall would be a long way off. For now, Miami was his market and his canvas. He was busy converting the city's appetite into an empire, one bank transfer at a time. In that moment, power was not merely taken, it was engineered. And in the quiet between shipments, as yachts rocked and neon dissolved into shoreline, an operator was drafting the rules of an enterprise that would make headlines and haunt law enforcement for generations. The enterprise, Mario Tabraue's criminal corporation, power hides in structures, how a man turned streetcraft into a corporation, and how a corporation turned into a state inside a state. He did not build a gang, he built an enterprise. Think in terms of departments: procurement, logistics, compliance of a sort, and enforcement. Each had a purpose, each had a budget, and each was accountable. The procurement teams were responsible for sourcing product, forming relationships with suppliers who operated beyond borders. Logistics handled movement, false manifests, reflagged vessels, legitimate-looking cargo holds that masked contraband. Compliance, the euphemism for laundering, took profits through restaurants, front real estate deals, and exotic animal imports that doubled as both eccentricities and institutional cover. The zoological business was a masterstroke of tradecraft. Exotic fauna moved freely across borders with permits and bills of sale. A tiger crate becomes a document that justifies a lane through customs. Where an ordinary smuggler would fear customs, an operator with a zoo could buy a narrative: conservation, exhibition, philanthropy. The spectacle of pet tigers served multiple purposes: intimidation, distraction, and plausible deniability. A man who kept big cats at his properties did not simply breed beasts for vanity. He manufactured a story that left investigators flustered. Who expects a kingpin to behave like a zookeeper? Financial architecture was equally cunning. Money was segmented into accounts that spoke in different languages. Offshore entities provided buffers. Shell companies recorded the fiction of commerce. Real estate purchases disguised the movement of capital. Luxury vehicles parked as inventory masked payroll. In the offices, ledgers read like the coding of a legitimate import business, and the men who created them had the fluency to explain every transfer. Accountants became as valuable as enforcers because in this economy, a number could be as lethal as a gunshot. But efficiency alone would not secure power. The enterprise's strength came from a merciless attention to eliminating leakages. Debts were managed, betrayals were punished. The enforcement division was not merely muscle, it was message discipline. Very few killings were chaotic. They were calculated statements, broadcast in ways that struck both fear and obedience. A disappearing associate did more to stabilize cash flow than any bribe. It signaled the cost of wavering. Networks of loyalty were constructed through reciprocity. Local operators were given territories. Middlemen were paid in bulk. Lawmen and couriers were bought with the promise of uninterrupted business. Expansion required diplomacy, criminal diplomacy, and he mastered both. Alliances with other cartels were brokered like mergers. Rival bosses were either absorbed into the network or neutralized. International pockets of power were mapped and cultivated. A port in one country, a warehouse in another, an accountant who never asked a question. He was less a warlord than an executive who moved product along supply chains and measured risk in transit times. This kind of empire required a culture, a corporate culture, where obedience was encouraged by reward and deterred by consequence. He trained lieutenants not just in violence, but in process. Members were taught to fill forms, to keep receipts, to talk like businessmen when required. The cognitive dissonance was deliberate. If someone could act like a businessman in public and an enforcer at night, they were more valuable. Institutional discipline made the group adaptable and, crucially, less detectable. But empires that hybridize legitimacy and crime are fragile in a specific way. Their legal vulnerabilities are scalable. A single misfiled document, an overheard conversation, a slipped translation, any small error could expand into an audit or a court case. So the enterprise invested heavily in vetting, in compartmentalization, in creating redundancies that allowed the machine to run, even if individual parts failed. Yet even the best machines generate heat. Paranoia crept into the ranks as success multiplied risk. People who once sent money in good faith now worried where it disappeared. Members who once trusted a boss now noticed the private jets and the palaces. With growth came risk of exposure. With exposure came the very thing they had feared. Attention from agencies with resources and patience. The same international channels that moved drugs could be used by investigators to map money flows. The speed that once protected them now made them visible. And so the leader adapted again. He leaned into plausible industry, into spectacle, the exotic animals, the charitable events, anything that could build a veneer of respectability. It was the final layer of camouflage, living like a celebrity, transacting like a businessman, operating like a sovereign. His personal brand did more than attract followers. It blurred lines for those who wanted to believe a redemption arc more than the facts. Remember, this was not chaos. This was an operation honed to a razor edge. When the machine worked, it produced results that many governments could not match in speed or coordination. When it failed spectacularly. Operation Cobra. Every empire believes it is invisible, right up until the moment it isn't. Operation Cobra didn't begin with sirens or arrests. It began with patience, with listening, with watching patterns repeat themselves just enough to become predictable. For years, investigators had chased fragments, partial conversations, unexplained financial flows, names that appeared and vanished before charges could stick. What they lacked wasn't evidence, it was cohesion. Operation Cobra was designed to change that. Instead of attacking individual crimes, authorities shifted focus to structure. They weren't interested in who pulled the trigger or who moved the package. They wanted to know who authorized it, who benefited, who enforced silence. Slowly, a picture emerged. Financial records revealed shell companies nested inside legitimate businesses. Communication logs showed hierarchies masked as casual exchanges. Travel patterns exposed coordination disguised as coincidence. Nothing alone was enough. Together, it was devastating. Wagers, aware that scrutiny was intensifying, doubled down on control. Communications became more abstract. Meetings rarer, intermediaries multiplied. He believed distance equaled protection. In reality, it created documentation. Every layer added to obscure responsibility became another link in the chain. Every trusted lieutenant became another potential liability. Operation Cobra exploited that reality. Investigators didn't rush. They let the organization operate, documenting its rhythm. They mapped who called whom, who responded first, who deferred decisions upward. They studied silence as much as speech. When Wagers instructed his people not to engage with authorities, it wasn't defiance, it was confirmation. It demonstrated authority, direction, leadership. The cost of control. Every empire leaves behind a shadow. When the machinery finally stopped moving, when the phones went quiet and the accounts froze, the absence was louder than any explosion. For years, Wagers had been the axis around which everything turned. Orders flowed outward. Loyalty flowed upward. Fear filled the space in between. And then, suddenly, there was nothing to orbit. Inside confinement, time no longer bent to strategy. There were no meetings to run, no disputes to settle, no signals to decode. The world he once governed moved on without him. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, but efficiently. As if the system had been waiting for permission to forget him. That was the final cruelty. Because power doesn't die in a blaze, it dissolves. Those who once spoke his name carefully stopped speaking it at all. The rules he enforced survived him, but his authority did not. New figures filled the vacuum, quieter, leaner, less burdened by legacy. They learned from his mistakes without honoring his sacrifices. And in that silence, the truth settled in. Control had cost him everything. In the early days, Wagers believed freedom meant choosing his own rules. Later, he believed it meant enforcing them. But the longer he held power, the narrower his world became. Trust turned conditional. Loyalty became transactional. Every relationship was measured for risk. By the end, the empire existed to protect itself, not the man who built it. And yet, there was no dramatic regret, no public reckoning, no apology, just recognition. Recognition that fear, once wielded as a weapon, had reshaped him as much as it reshaped others. That discipline, once a tool for order, had hardened into isolation. That leadership built on silence leaves no one to speak when it's over. From behind walls that no reputation could penetrate, Wagers became what he had once ruled over. A man defined by limits. The irony was unavoidable. The system that finally caught him didn't overpower him. It outlasted him. It studied him. It adapted. And when it struck, it did so without emotion. The same way his empire had operated for years. That symmetry wasn't lost on anyone who understood the game. Outside, stories continued to circulate. Some painted him as a legend undone by ambition, others as a cautionary tale. In certain circles, he was still spoken of with respect, not because of what he did, but because of how long he managed to do it. Longevity in that world is its own currency. But time has a way of flattening myths. What remains now isn't the fear he commanded or the structure he built. It's the absence he left behind, a reminder that even the most controlled systems fracture when their center disappears. Because fear can organize people, but it cannot replace trust, and it cannot survive scrutiny forever. Wagers' rise wasn't inevitable. His fall wasn't accidental. Both were the product of choices, calculated, disciplined, and relentless. That's the part that makes his story uncomfortable. There was no single mistake, no moment of weakness, no betrayal dramatic enough to pin everything on. Just a gradual tightening of the circle until there was nowhere left to stand. And that is how most empires truly end. Not with chaos, but with containment. Not with violence, but with paperwork. Not with screams, but with silence. Somewhere beyond the reach of influence and intimidation, the world keeps moving. New players emerge. Old rules are rewritten. And the stories of men like Wagers become lessons passed quietly from one generation to the next. Not warnings, blueprints. Because in the end, the most dangerous legacy isn't fear, it's proof that it worked, for a while. And for those still watching from the shadows, that may be the most powerful message of all.